Hello, everyone. Welcome to Mind Money Balance. I'm so excited to have Dr. Shainna Ali here. You may have heard her years ago, literally on the Mind Money Balance podcast before we kind of shifted into helping a broader audience of people at the intersection of money and mental health. And I'm excited to bring her back for another conversation about money and self-love. For those of you who don't know who she is, I'm going to read off her bio and take notes. It is so impressive. So, Dr. Shainna is a mental health counselor, educator, and advocate who is passionate about destigmatizing mental health and helping individuals worldwide with the importance of fostering mental wellness. She has created the Self-Love Workbook, the Self-Love Workbook for teens, Luna Finds Love Everywhere, a self-love book for kids, and the Self-Love Planner, and Designing Healthy Boundaries. Like, it's so impressive. She's been featured on so many different media outlets, including ABC, CBS, NPR, Washington Post, Insider, and many, many more. She owns and operates Integrated Counseling Solutions, a strengths-based clinical mental health and consulting practice in Central Florida. She and I are both dealing with incredible humidity at the time of this recording. And she served on the board of directors of the Mental Health Association of Central Florida and is the past president of the Florida Association for Multicultural Counseling and Development. We love that. She has been honored with the Association for Specialists in Group Work's Al Dye Award, the Pete Fisher Humanitarian Award, and UCF's 30 Under 30 and Noble Knight distinctions for her efforts promoting mental wellness. When she is not doing all of those things, writing, being a therapist, hosting, advocating, she's also a wife, a mother, a friend who actively strives for growth and spends time with family, friends, practicing yoga, moving her body, learning new lessons, and traveling the globe. Shainna, welcome back.
Lindsay, thank you so much for having me. And oh my gosh, please catch your breath. That was such a mouthful. I appreciate the long and thorough introduction. It's always odd to hear you're like, oh, that's me. I don't know if you have that experience. I'm always like, oh wow, I have to like sit and listen, which I appreciate because there is something self-loving to having to hear about who you are and sit in your truth of like, that's who you are, right? We should all listen to our own introduction sometimes.
Oh my gosh, that's going to be your new asterisk for the next version of your self-love workbook is going to be write out your bio, read it to yourself in the mirror, record it, and just like bask in the excitement because you're so right. I want to point out something you did not do, which a lot of people do when we introduce them or when we do their bios. They go, oh my gosh, that's so embarrassing. I can't believe that. Ugh. And you didn't do that. You said, thanks for hanging out in that space. Thanks for acknowledging these things. It is such an experience to sit and let those accomplishments kind of wave over me. So I want to honor that you also sat in that and modeled what a gift it is just to experience the joy of like patting ourselves on the back or having somebody else hold up our accolades for us.
That's really kind of you to recognize that and highlight it because I was sitting here slight cringy. Oh gosh, she's reading the whole thing. Okay, we're doing this.
Yes.
And it does. It's the mix of emotions, right? That
Yeah.
and experience is, whoa, that is you. Sit there and listen to it, right? Sit here firm and know you did that. That's you. So these things that it's good to hear. And also, oh gosh, I don't want to be touted in any sort of way. This took a long time. This has not happened overnight. There's a lot of awkwardness that happens with it. And one of my self-love practices that I'm working in is receiving other people's kindness. You also, I want to acknowledge, you could have shortened that. You really could have. And I think it's out of pure respect and recognizing what it is to diminish someone's identity or another woman in particular, right? Another marginalized person in a variety of ways.
Yeah.
Reading someone's full identity and sharing that's a powerful thing to offer someone. And I don't want to admonish that in any way by being like, oh no, that's nothing, stop, move on, awkward. So I like to sit in my awkwardness sometimes, right? I think that there's something self-loving about that because there's opportunities for grace and
Oh,
compassion.
wow. Well, we can just go back and forth and just, shower ourselves in this self-love. And also we're going to share some other things with the audience today. So just to catch people up to speed on how you and I met, I see your book, your very first book, baby, over your shoulder, the Self Love Workbook, and mine, the Financial Anxiety Solution, is over my shoulder. Shainna and I share a publisher, and we were connected through them. And over the past few years, we've been able to maintain that professional friendship and support each other. And I'm really, really excited to bring her on to just do a little refresher on self love, and in particular, how it intersects with money. So let's start there with the question you've answered so many times, but deserves another refresh. What is self love?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to start at that foundational level because a lot of people start there, but a lot of people don't. I'm always intrigued by not. And I think it's based off of the assumption like we know what it is, we hear about it all the time. So let's get into how do we do it, right? And I value and respect that. But the truth is, in my work, I found that people define self love in a variety of ways. Even in the workbook, before sharing what I believe is the definition of self love that I've come to from my own personal experience, but in working with clients, of course, I encourage folks define self love for you. So, for everyone who's tuning in, if you have the opportunity to pause, take a breath, and just sit with what does it even mean before I say what I think it means, that can be really powerful because may be moments that we align in our definition, and there may be some things that are glaring. Doesn't mean it's wrong, could be, right? Then we'll get into probably a little bit of that. But I want you to keep that in mind because self love is so subjective. So while I know a few things about self love, everyone listening, you are the experts in yourselves. So make space for that first. But I have tried to whittle down this definition as much as possible over time. And I see self love as the active practice of accepting, caring for, and encouraging yourself. I encourage people to pause and just sit with that and compare and contrast where you're at, what you've ever been told, what you've ever been led to believe. Does it fit? Does it not fit? And I know also that that might seem a little like broad, abstract, like, okay, but then how? And I want to share that that's actually where the self love workbook came from, is because I recognize that a lot of us want to develop self love and we're curious about the concept even before even wanting to develop it. And it can seem really daunting and intimidating. And that's why I've also broken down the 7 love segments, which I think can help move that definition a little bit more. That self love is comprised of multiple areas, some you may have heard of, including self awareness, self exploration, self care, a very popular one, self esteem, a historically popular one, self kindness, self respect, and self growth.
This is amazing. So you gave us so much here. So I want to do a little recap of the things that you said. So when you are trying to boil down self-love into the soundbite, what it comes down to is how can we as individuals honor the practice of accepting and encouraging ourselves with compassion. And then what I love about this is that there are many different dimensions and there are many different ways. And, we know this as humans, and we also know this as mental health care practitioners, that there is no one size fits all. And so I love that you said, look, it can be broken down into all of these different ways: awareness, exploration, care, self esteem, kindness, respect, and growth. And I imagine that giving people the space to say, here's the dimension of self love where I want to start, or here's the dimension of self love that gives me a lot of anxiety and I get a lot of fear around, can be like the very first self-love practice, in that it gives you the autonomy to say, here's where I'm at, here's where I want to start, or here's the area that needs a little TLC. Have you found that to be true? Like giving people kind of the container and then also the space ends up working out really well.
Absolutely. I have in the workbook pretty early on, exactly because of what you're saying, a model of this that it's broken down and it can be used as just a reflection tool. I really like grabbing colored pencils and kind of shading it in of which areas do I feel strong in?
Yeah.
Which areas am I currently thriving in?
Mm.
Which areas look different today than they've looked last month, last decade, right? When I was a child. There's so much that can be done with that from assessment. And I think that that in and of itself absolutely is a self love practice. And I like repeating that practice over certain increments of time. And that can be really helpful, especially to harness that self growth aspect of checking in on how far you've come, where you're at now, and where you'd like to go.
I mean, I heard you kind of say at the very beginning, kind of where people go not wrong with self love, but where they kind of get stuck. And it's in trying to define it in a certain way or thinking it's, not for them or thinking maybe they already have a practice. But I'm curious, like, why should people even bother? Like, if there's a skeptic listening and they're like, oh, great, another thing I have to add to my list, why do you think it is important for each of us to cultivate our version of a self love practice?
Oh gosh, yeah, I think it's hard because I'm so biased at this point that I just truly believe self-love is essential for each and every one of us. I noticed in my practice as a mental health counselor and educator that while everyone was different coming into the office or coming into the classroom, something that seemed to be consistent from person to person was some sort of lacking in self-love, and for many, the inability to foster that, or that their current perceived inability to foster that. So over time, I've developed a totally biased standpoint that we all need self love. But I have a lot of compassion for the folks who sit here and like, yeah, another thing to do that doesn't matter that much. And I think it's because of their definition. Their definition likely doesn't sound like mine. And again, a lot of that is okay. But their definition might have misconceptions about self love. And that I find problematic. Misconceptions like self love is selfish. So if I'm investing in my self love, it starts and ends there, which could not be further from the truth. As a mother, as a therapist, as a partner, I can tell you that everyone else knows when my self love is lacking, because the self love is the focal point that you can invest in. It feels much more manageable than trying to control anyone else in the world, but it does pour out into. Another misconception is that self love is narcissistic. So there's this really restrictive focus on the self. And that's not the case either, especially in this season of life. Self love I invest in because of that ripple down effect, because of my responsibilities as a provider, as an educator, as a parent, etc. So there's that aspect as well. And then I think many times we don't realize how much self love is intertwined with our mental health and therefore our overall well being. So if you're lacking self love, that's going to show up in your physical well being, your nutritional health, if applicable, your spiritual health, it's going to show up in all of those places. And a lot of those areas can feel really daunting. But the thing about self love that makes it really approachable is it's you, right? So if there's something that you can do, it's sitting, reflecting, looking at yourself, like you are totally capable of that.
What I heard there, that essentially it gives us, if I were to kind of summarize what you're saying, the nutrients or the fertilizer, to use a cliche gardening metaphor, to ensure that the things that we're already doing to take care of ourselves can thrive. And in that thriving, it becomes this ripple effect, not just to people in our immediate vicinity, like our partner or our child or our dog or our friends, but also in modeling for our communities how practicing self love is a benefit. It isn't selfish, it isn't narcissistic. In fact, it's actually the opposite. Like when we pour into ourselves, we are able to then pour into others in our community in that way. And in tying this in with numbers, I can hypothesize, given the work that I do as a financial therapist, that you've probably seen or experienced how self love and our relationship with money intersect. Can you tell me about how our relationship with money and our relationship with our self love intersect? How do they overlap?
The self love workbook in general and my work in self love, I choose a more holistic paradigm, right? So I obviously work mostly in the realm of mental wellness, but it is not lost on me that your mental health doesn't just sit in this like comfy compartment over here and doesn't affect other aspects. So finances can affect your relationships separate from like mental health, right? So I just think they all intertwine. So first of all, they do intersect and we have to acknowledge that they intersect, right? Now, how do they intersect? Okay. Your self love, I think, is often like the start for many things, but it's very chicken or the egg. So it's hard to trace back, right? But let's look at those segments that I was talking about earlier, right? And we can go through each one and see how finances pop up, because finances or overall financial well being, that's a potential catalyst for your self love practice. On the opposite end of that, there could be obstacles in there for your self love too. So, working on the self love can then help your financial well being. So, like self awareness, I'm thinking about the habit of folks swiping or automatic payments and they don't really know where their money is going. There's a lack of awareness there. There's a lack of self awareness, which means a lack of financial awareness and lack of financial like empowerment, right? Self exploration. Gosh, I keep running into debt. What is happening there? Instead of just like, oh, keep running into it. Good thing I still have this credit limit or loans or whatever. It's what's happening, that curious mindset with compassion and grace. Self care, I think there are so many opportunities. You would tell us better than I could of the variety of things you can do within the financial domain that can actually be self care. The immediate one that comes to mind is budgeting, right? Just being able to take the time to think about what needs to go where and prioritizing it. That's helping both your financial wellness and your mental wellness at the same time. Self esteem. Oh, and I know your work gets into a lot of this. Our beliefs around money, like what we've been led to believe, the practices that we have conditioned when in us, what we learn in the messages from society, culture, family, in addition to the ones that we extrapolate. And these are now our own messages about finances that interplays. Self kindness and respect go hand in hand. Once you go through those steps and you know, okay, well, this is where I stand, how are you going to treat yourself with this gentle compassion as you now move towards that self growth, too? So, setting these goals and employing all these things in that process, they're so interwoven. While I'm trying to say it more as like self love affects financial wellness in this way, it's hard to not go back and forth because, again, they're so intertwined. But I think a lot of times I've found people in my office when they're experiencing some sort of financial stressor, perhaps a huge financial setback, and they don't realize how it has affected their overall self esteem, their confidence, their trust in themselves and in other people, that sometimes illuminating that is really empowering for mental health, but overall well being.
What you said is actually quite radical, Shayna. So many of my clients and so many people who are kind of like in my audience have such negative associations with money. There's a lot of fear, there's a lot of disgust, there's a lot of confusion and misunderstanding. And so to say to somebody that your relationship with your finances can actually be an act of self love is truly radical. Like when I think about when I'm working with my clients around how they can cultivate even a neutral relationship with money, not even a positive relationship with money, it can take a lot of work, right? It can
Yeah.
take a lot of undoing and untangling and getting incredibly curious about why we have these beliefs about money and how those fears in some ways act as a protector, right? If I'm fearful of money, then I never have to engage with it. So for you to say, hey, getting a little bit aware about your relationship with money can be an act of self-love, I think may blow some people's minds. Like, I have to imagine that that comes up because even as a
Yep.
person who practices financial therapy full time, I'm sure that people think self-love and finances existing together in the same space is radical. So have you had people kind of come to you with like, you're talking something kind of bananas here?
Yes, and in many
Yeah.
spaces, right? So, in the comfort of a counseling office, in a lot of my classrooms, many times when I'm doing consulting work, especially at bigger corporations and institutions, everyone's like, what? And I think a lot of times people think I'm trying to say something, I'm trying to sell something, some sort of shtick. And I'm like, no, no, I believe this. Like, give me a moment. And I think it's because general mental health stigma keeps us away from thinking about self love at all, and there's a lot of obstacles around us being able to even say, oh, self love is important to me. And all of that stands in the way of our ability to see all the variety of ways that we can practice self love. Then you pair that with like marketing campaigns. And so now you have, in your inbox saying self love is the new pair of shoes, the vacation, and it might be. But then there's these like, not so sexy ways. Maybe the average person that like budgeting is self love. Like, no, I'd rather get on this trip to Guam and, escape from the world. But then there's these things that feel like adulting, right? It just feels like a responsibility, this thing I have to do. And sometimes the joy of self love and the real like untapped power is seeing all these things that, yes, there are responsibilities, but just because they're responsibilities and they matter and they're important, that doesn't mean they aren't opportunities for self love. It's the exact opposite.
I love this because you're telling and saying and mirroring all of these things that come up so often in my work. Budgeting as an act of self love probably feels so out there. And so, this is where I think you and I share a philosophy that, like, if the term budgeting or if the term self-love doesn't resonate with you, you have full permission to rebrand it, to soften it, to morph it. And so it may be the person who's like, budgeting feels really scary. But when I hear Shainna say things like, well, it may be scary and it can be an act of self-awareness. It can be an act of self-exploration. I think that helps us to move from feeling like a budget is kind of this big scary thing controlling us, and much more of this thing that allows us to be in charge of what we're doing with our money. One of my favorite reframes for a budget is just to call it a spending plan. It's the exact same thing, but just in that slight softening, you get the opportunity to say, I'm allowed to use my money in this way. I'm allowed to respect the money that I'm bringing in and to respect the outflow. And I get to decide where it goes. I'm curious if you're comfortable sharing maybe a personal example of how you've used self-love to help nurture your relationship with money, or if there's maybe a specific task where you had to tap into self-love in order to finish that financial task.
Two different things come to mind. One is the recent past and one is the present. And I think about, how my self-love was really hampered by the choice to pursue my doctorate meant that I had to take out substantial loans at the time. I had some funding, but I needed to survive for that amount of time. And I knew that decision going in. I signed these papers, I know it, but it's still a really hard choice to sit with. And by that time, I had done a lot of self care in managing debt and not having lots of expenses. And honestly, being quite proud of that, being quite frugal and careful. And I'm like, oh, but now I have like tens of thousands, like it's just sitting with that. I think also because finances are so quantifiable, it's jarring to see this big thing. There's like heaviness. And it really made me like step back and say, was this worth it? Now, am I ready for this? Am I capable of this? Can I do this? And I gave myself space for that. And this is like in the midst of like my developing self-love too. This is a while back. And then I was like, wait, what the heck? This is absolutely when I want to. This is my choice. I can do this. And I'm really grateful that actually a lot of the self-love workbook has helped me pay for a lot of my loans. So that's something, it was a really humbling time for me to kind of sit with, oh, my finances are not flourishing. So therefore my self-love feels like it has been affected. And it was. And also working through that has really helped me to feel self-loving again in terms of finances. I hear you with the semantics around budget. And I think feeling like I had to be so budgeted felt really restrictive, and I didn't like that as a free soul. I didn't like that at all, but I was happy to do it knowing what that meant for my financial and my overall wellness. Now, coming back to the present, it is budgeting. I've been kind of intertwining this with parts work. So, acknowledging that my reaction to my budget today, tomorrow, the next day may not just be coming from like comprehensive me, but it could be coming from like an inner child. It could be coming from post grad me, future me. Like, where are these thoughts about my budget in the current moment happening from? Whether they're healthy thoughts and positive thoughts, encouraging thoughts, or unhelpful, challenging, self defeating thoughts. That has been a really new thing for me, kind of just saying, like, it's not just my view. Then that helps me to know which aspects are like, need a high five, like, thank you for coming in and saying this is what we need to do and we're capable, or which pieces of me need a little bit of like a hug and nurturance. So taking parts work, which is not new to me, and budgeting, which is not new to me, and just blending them together to make like the perfect dessert.
Your experience with student loans is something that I hear all the time with debt of any type. It could be a student loan, it could be an auto loan, it could be credit card debt, it could be medical debt. But what I heard you say is how much it impacted your self-esteem to log in and see that number, and how it felt like a quantifiable reflection of your worth or your worthiness. And I want to thank you for being so transparent about that, because it feels so scary to say, like, I made a conscientious decision to take out this loan, even though I knew it might be a scary number to see. You said something interesting. You're like, I knew that I had to take out those loans to literally get through it, right? Like, I have to survive as I go in and get my doctorate. And that meant that I couldn't, not take out the loan or try and burn myself out in the process. It was honestly, like I heard, an act of self-love to take out the loans, which I think so many people will, again, find pretty mind-blowing, to say, I knew I had to take out that loan in order to give myself literally the breathing space that I needed to take care of myself, to feed myself, to nurture myself, to make sure that I'm getting to and from school, to make sure that I have the time and the space to study and to attend class. Like, that's also really powerful. The other part of what you were sharing about your relationship with self love and money was something that you'd been doing for a long time, budgeting and practicing self love. And I highlight that because I think so often when people are working with people who they perceive to be experts, they imagine that that person has never experienced or hasn't experienced the type of pain or confusion or frustration around the things that we talk about and the things that we help provide advocacy and education on. And there are always going to be new things that come up that necessitate revisiting skills that we have, right? Like you said, I had a budget for years and I felt pretty good about it. And then something changed. And all of a sudden I had to go back and like really get curious about it and really get kind with myself and revisit it.
Well, I really appreciate you mentioning that because a lot of times when I'm looking at self care, I encourage folks to look at their different dimensions of wellness
Yeah.
and what that foundational aspect of self care is in each. And the reason why budgeting is not new to me and why I still use it, regardless of where I believe or feel like I'm at in life, is because it's my foundational self care in terms of financial well being for me. But that's like my go to thing. If I feel like there's any sort of struggle, it's the thing I go to. I know it. I feel capable. That already boosts my self esteem to get to the other goals. But with that being said, the foundational thing is not something I expect myself or anyone else to grow out of. And I think a lot of times when we think about self care, it becomes this like hierarchical thing of, I'd like to not need that, right? I'd like to do this fun kind of self care. But also, these foundational things are things I don't want to ever grow out of. I don't want to grow out of needing yoga in my life. That's like my physical thing. I don't want a world that I don't have that. I also don't want a world for myself that I'm not budgeting. Like, these are my foundational things. So it might not be foundational for everyone, but it is foundational for me. And with that loan thing, something I had to sit with in the choice, which I really appreciate that you recognize in an empowered way, was also privilege that I didn't have and lack of access. So it's not like I had money sitting in savings. It's not like I could choose to go to a family member, a loved one to say, hey, can you pay for this for me? Because I know you support this journey. The generational wealth that doesn't exist in my world. And it's something I would like for it to exist, but it didn't at that time. And that's something that I had to like sit with and grieve and mourn and not shame myself or my lineage or my systems or my culture for. And instead, I was able to kind of take that around and say, well, that's why I did the loan. This is why I chose to do this too. And seeing it beyond me, because sometimes we get so narrow minded, but self love is seeing how we affect the system and how the system affects us too.
When we talk about money in general, we don't often personalize it. We like to
Mhm.
talk about it at an arm's length, which is a
Yeah.
great safety building skill, right? To talk about money as this abstract thing that doesn't exist with me. But for you to say, like, here are actually the reasons why I had to take it out, I would love for you to share what are you doing these days to practice mind money balance?
I think the biggest one is one that I kind of alluded to a little bit. Definitely budgeting. That's my 101, but it gets
Yeah.
built on in a variety of ways. Today, my budget doesn't just look like this is my income flow and how I just keep my head above water. It's also like, how do I budget for joy? How
Mm.
do I budget for connection? So there is a financial component, but I've also added a lot of these more like intra and interpersonal components that I found that to be really helpful because it's nice to be able to like add that to other things. I'm also trying my best to not, I'm sure you're familiar with like the girl math trend. I am trying to hold myself accountable for any of my own obstacles within finances. In this newer phase of life as a mother, it's very easy for me to just, I want him to have this. I didn't have this,
Mm.
like this changes things. It's really easy for me to make much more emotional decisions around finances than I have historically. So just knowing that it's a new thing that I need to work on, that's been big. And also, having conversations about financial
Yeah.
well-being has
Yeah.
been really helpful. I think there is stigma around finance. You mentioned this like arm's length safety. And I'm used to stigma. I am really used to that in the mental health realm. So it's just the things that are stigmatized, we need to talk about. So
Yeah.
even sharing my truth here, which I really value the opportunity to do that, having conversations with loved ones about finances, whatever that looks like, that's important. And integrating that a lot into my therapy space too, because that holds me accountable. As a practitioner, I'm really big on don't say anything to your client that you wouldn't want to hear yourself or that is, antithetical to who you are. So if I'm going to
Mhm.
talk to someone about their finances, their budgets, their financial anxieties, I need to be willing to do that work too. So just holding
Yeah.
myself accountable to some of these things has been really important over the course of my life.
Oh, thank you for sharing all of those different examples of how you're practicing mind money balance. As we kind of tie everything up, how can people find you? How can people purchase your books? Tell us.
I am mostly on Instagram at Dr. Shaina. You can also find me and just general resources at drshaina.com. The books are available wherever sold. I encourage you to purchase local if you can. And then just for general, accessible, free mental health content, you might want to tune into the Mental Wellness Practice podcast, especially because Lindsay's going to be on soon.
Yes. Yes, I'm so excited to have the tables turned very soon and I'll get to be lovingly asked questions about financial therapy and all that good stuff. Well, thank you so
And
much,
hear
Shayna,
your
for
bio
everything.
too.
Oh
You'll
my
have to
gosh, yeah,
hear your bio.
my turn
So
to have my bio read. We'll see if I can be as poised. I hope I can. Thank you so, so much. I so appreciate this, and we will see you soon.